Welcome to the Testing Business Ideas webinar featuring guests David Bland and Beth McKeon and sponsored by the Columbia Venture Community. I am your host today and moderator, Ryan McCarrigan. We are extremely excited to welcome both of these fantastic speakers. Both of them will have an opportunity to introduce themselves momentarily, but first, a few words about the Columbia Venture Community. So founded in 2006, the Columbia Venture Community, or CVC, is a private network of nearly 6,000 Columbia University alumni, students, and staff who are interested in all aspects of entrepreneurship and innovation, with chapters in New York City, San Francisco, London, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Los Angeles, San Diego, Denver, and Seoul, South Korea, with several new chapters launching soon in Asia and in Europe. So our mission at CVC is a simple one. For over a decade, we have aimed to foster entrepreneurship among Columbia alumni, students, and staff by facilitating communication, providing access to needed resources, and creating a vibrant and supportive community. To this end, we promote events in major cities around the globe, including happy hours, startup pitch events, incubation seminars, speaker panels, and more. Given the worldwide impacts of coronavirus, however, we have pivoted to running all virtual events for the foreseeable future. Some upcoming events. Our next big online event will be about marketing a startup with Hubble co-founder and co-CEO Jesse Horwitz. That will be on May 15th. And if you're interested in learning more about how to market an early stage startup, we'll talk about keeping to a budget, achieving product market fit, aligning customer feedback with product development, and much more. And that will be hosted by CVC's Global VP, Cortland Thomas. And if you're interested in learning more about CVC in general, just type in columbia.vc in your browser. That'll bring you to our homepage. And for all of these links and more information about CVC, check out the email that we're going to send you later this week. That will also include a recording and written transcript of today's webinar. So for today, to get started, some of the takeaways that you will learn about in today's talk, we're going to cover the importance of identifying and testing risky business assumptions as quickly as possible, why rapid experimentation and learning often provide a clearer picture of early stage risk than other more traditional measures, why the book Testing Business Ideas should be required reading for all virtual accelerator directors and participants, and finally, how might our understanding of entrepreneurial risk change or need to adapt in the post-coronavirus era. And so we have some really fantastic guests today. So David and Beth, you'll want to unmute now. So I'm really excited first to introduce David Bland, who is a longtime colleague of mine in the Lean Startup community. David advises companies on how to find product market fit using Lean Startup, design thinking, and business model innovation. And of course, he is the co-author of Testing Business Ideas with Alex Osterwalder. So David, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. Yeah, I grew up in startups. I went to school for design, and I joined the first startup out of college and realized I had to learn to code and everything else at a startup, as you do. Also really interesting in my career, it was a kind of a point that really influenced me because we thought we were a B2C company and we ended up being a B2B company before we were acquired for 16 million. And I think that just shaped my whole career. So fast forward to today, for the last 10 years or so, I've been in the Bay Area helping entrepreneurships, or entrepreneurs at accelerators, helping corporations around the world basically test their way through anything new, because the way you shape ideas and the way you test them, they don't always come out looking like you imagine in the beginning. So I apply a lot of what I have in the book. It's just basically what I do in my work, kind of in book form. So yeah, that's what I do. I just help a lot of pre-product market fit companies and teams find out if there's a there.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Well, we're really excited to have you here today and really eager to hear about how that experience informed the design of your new book. Our next guest is Beth McKeon. Hey, Beth. Beth is the founder and CEO of Fluent Studio, an entrepreneurial R&D lab that has designed and facilitated over a dozen virtual accelerator programs across 5 states and developed a revolutionary new tool, the Fluency Score, to measure product market fit in early stage innovation. Welcome, Beth.
Hi, thanks so much, Ryan. And it's a pleasure to be here with David as well, during this webinar with all of you. Just to share a little bit about myself, I'm an entrepreneur first and foremost, and built a company, kind of went through the process of going through an accelerator, trying to find product market fit and growing, and ended up selling that company in 2017, while also getting recruited into accelerator management, and ran an accelerator for 2 years, in-person, traditional 13-week accelerator program, and really was interested at that point in how we could expand our understanding of how we support founders in programs like accelerators. So launched Fluent in 2018, really as an experiment to see what would happen if we tried to expand the idea of an accelerator, not just to see which companies should get investment, but how we could kind of predictably and scalably support startups everywhere. Because my interest has always been in how do we bring this knowledge and this expertise to founders that aren't just in New York City or the Bay Area or in kind of specialized locations, and how do we really ensure that startups can be successful no matter where they want to live. So we're based out of Denver, but we work in Alabama, Massachusetts, Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, and sort of non-traditional startup communities all over the country.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. Also, really eager to see how your experience and your work intersect with David's work around risk, which is the subject for today. As you said, you're coming in to us live from Denver. David and I are based in the Bay Area. Most of our listeners are in the New York metropolitan area, obviously because of their affiliation with Columbia, but we also have folks coming in from East Asia and from Europe that I see. Yeah, so we're going to get started now. Sorry, I went on mute for a moment. David's going to talk about the book, Testing Business Ideas, what led him to write it, and he's going to give a bit of an overview of what the book talks about. David, I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Ryan, and just kind of forward through, if you don't mind, as we get through this. So if you want to go forward, basically, we came to this conclusion by working with teams all around the world, and I work with some accelerators out here in the Valley. We just realized that people are still jumping to build way too quickly. And we thought, Alex has had 2 successful books already. He just released a new one this month called Invincible Company. The prior books were business model generation and value prop design. And so he's kind of created this kind of canon already about like, how do you structure using a business model canvas? How do you go, test those ideas? And, when we had this conversation of like why we'd ever want to write a book together, it was, we needed almost like a job story, if you think of jobs to be done. And what we came up with was this, basically, when I have a business idea, I want to be able to rapidly test it so I don't build something nobody wants. And I feel like time and time again, we're still jumping to scale way too quickly. So we thought, there's a big gap in between, if you want to forward, Ryan, if there's a gap in between, people sketching out their canvas and then running experiments. And time again, when I'm an accelerator, I'd say, hey, raise your hand if you've ever used a business model canvas. And the whole cohort would raise their hand usually. And they were exposed to it either online or through some kind of entrepreneurship program at a university. But they were really having a hard time, making it actionable. And that's really what the whole point of the tool was. It was storytelling and making it actionable. And so nothing really the fault of the tool. It was just more of people needed a link between how do we, take what we have there and actually go run experiments. So Ryan, if you want to forward, basically what we ended up doing was saying, look, in my work, what I do with that canvas is I say, write down your assumptions. Like that whole thing is a bunch of question marks. And, whether using a value prop canvas or a business model canvas, write down those assumptions, and then go map them and see where to focus. And really, with regards to the book, it's a simple facilitated exercise, but I think where people were stuck was they weren't sure how to write down their assumptions and focus on their risk. And then the 2x2 we created, I first picked it up from Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden, working with them out of Neo. And I just kept iterating on it. And I was pulling in design thinking themes. And now it's been kind of pulled into the whole design sprint canon. If you go to Google's design sprint kit site, they have this mapping exercise now. They're listed as part of their resources. But basically it just kind of went, I don't want to say viral this time again, but it did spread, And so basically we, kind of took that and said, look, we can create a library of sorts of experiments to help people match their risk, to the experiment they're running. So Ryan, if you want to forward, basically there are two big blocks. One is discovery experiments. So there are 44 in the book. And what we did was we said, kind of building on Steve Blank's work from 4 Steps to Epiphany, which was hugely influential to my career, and also influenced Eric Ries, who I've also worked with in the past. Can we categorize these? And while I love 4 Steps, it was very customer focused. It was very much like customer discovery, customer development, it was customer validation. And what we decided is we want to go broader. And so basically what Alex and I did is we spent all the time of all these experiments we've created and helped manage. And we kind of categorized them. We said, hey, which ones are desirability? Which ones are viability? Which ones are feasibility? And it was really, really interesting exercise. Ryan, you can go ahead and go forward. So basically we had to categorize discovery and validation. And so in that you can choose kind of like where you're at in your journey and what kind of risk, like what's your next best test to run? Because ideally, I mean, these startup founders who they talk to like 5 customers and they go build their app. And I feel like you went from a really low strength of evidence, maybe even friends and family, small scale experiment to a very big scale, 600K experiment potentially. And we can do things in between to kind of pay down our risk. So if you want to go forward, Ryan. So basically, we had in the book laid out just this basically an actionable textbook for founders, for corporate innovators, for people that have side hustles on, hey, can we match the experiment we're trying to do to the risk we have? And so many people I meet, they do interviews, they do a landing page, maybe a survey, and that's it. And there's so much more available. So basically, we just try to create a library to help people choose what experiment to run to pay down their risk. So if we go into kind of why now, and I'm really interested, Ryan, and Beth, and your take on this as well. We are in a time of great uncertainty, to say the least. And if you look at kind of this, this chart, when you start on the left, you have an idea, everything's really uncertain. It kind of feels messy, can we apply process to that mess in some regard, and kind of almost like scientific method, right? Pulling from kind of lean startup to apply to building a business. And I feel like we're getting dragged back to the left here, especially a lot of companies who are becoming digital. They're kind of forced to be digital. It's like, congrats, you're all digital companies now, whether you like it or not. And so we almost have to go back into search and testing mode again. And I feel like, I'm really curious, Beth and Ryan, what your take is on this, but I feel like we're getting pulled back into this area of great uncertainty. And especially for the next, 12 to 18 months, specifically here in the US, how do we test our way through that again? And can we kind of use methods remotely instead of things that we would do in person? So Ryan and Beth, I'm really curious what your thoughts are on this too.
Oh, I have so many thoughts.
Go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, so David, this may be one of my favorite pages in the whole book. I mean, the book is phenomenal, and since discovering it, I've basically recommended it to everyone that I work with. But this page in particular struck me because it's part of the story that I've been telling founders for years as well, which is that in the beginning stages, it does look like this garbled mess of like backwards and forwards and just a lot of exploration. But in the end, it is going to feel like a straight line. And so often early stage founders are comparing where they're at in this like process of sorting through the uncertainty, and they're comparing themselves against companies that have already navigated all of that uncertainty, and there's a straight line to their kind of discovery process. And so they're hearing these stories that seem like there was a really straightforward approach that got them to success, but it wasn't like that at all. And I feel like this diagram starts to kind of give permission to founders to not know the answer too soon, and to really like sit with the discovery that has to happen and the experimentation that they need to do. And like you said, like not just do 3 tiny experiments that kind of maybe point in a direction and then consider that the proof that they need to go build the big thing, but really to like own the messiness of that innovation process for as long as they need to really know that they have it, and to do that de-risking in a much more disciplined way than I think is fairly common.
So David and Beth, I think we can all agree that discovery and validation work and experimentation in general are really important. Now, whether startups actually have been doing this hard work is sometimes questionable. We've been teaching that these are important principles for a long time, but how does our new environment with all of this added uncertainty and risk given coronavirus and the fact that a lot of investors are going to be more hesitant about throwing money at startups, how is that going to impact how we approach experimentation and risk moving forward?
Yeah, I'd love to take a stab at that. I think that what it's doing is it's laying bare that we can't just build without having some of these things figured out and having solid business fundamentals, like actually de-risking those assumptions is more critical than ever. And so startups that were kind of like punting on having to figure those things out and figuring that they can maybe just throw enough marketing dollars at it down the road when they could hire a team to do that, it's urgent to do it now. And ultimately, this is an amazing opportunity for scrappy, creative founders to solve legitimate problems that we're facing in society by not just like, there's no space, there's no margin for kind of like the gut reaction build. We need to do it in a systematic way. And the good news is there is an actual process for this that can ensure that founders reach that place where they're creating value and innovating in a successful way. It's actually not as risky as it might seem like it is if you use a process like this.
How much of this do you guys think really can be reduced to process? How much of it is luck?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily a spreadsheet you follow and then you have a billion-dollar business. I think there is can you create your own luck basically? And so I feel like behind luck is a lot of hard work. And in it, if you're like systematically breaking down what's my risk, how do I address that risk, and let's do that over and over again, that does feel like a process to me. And when I talk to founders, it's really interesting. Some of them who are like, oh, I would never use a canvas. And I'm like, well, explain to me how you're working through this. And sure enough, they're like, this is my value proposition to my customer and how I'm getting to them and how I make money. Like they're checking the box. Like they're explaining their way through this in a very much like a tool, right? But I think where sometimes founders have a challenge is communicating what's going inside their head. And that's not just externally, that's also with co-founders, that's within your team. And that's something we need to work on. And because you do need to have shared vision and a shared, explanation of how you're working with a common language. So I feel like it is a process and you are trying to make your own luck. But I feel like so many founders that I talk to who feel like, oh, I can never be constrained by a tool. When I have them explain how they work to me, it's very much like similar to how you'd visualize it in a tool. So it's just really interesting to me. And I think, I do think we're still, if we want to compare this to science, it's very much like a social science. In regards, I don't think we're quite at we're 10 years in with Lean Startup Movement, which is still pretty early. And I just don't think, we've really even scratched the surface of what we can do. But I feel like it's a process where you're trying to kind of manufacture your own luck.
So why don't we switch gears a little bit now? If this is a process, not a dogmatic one, but a process that sort of facilitates the art and science of some of this decision making around risk, what are some ways that we can begin to apply these principles? All three of us have had a lot of experience teaching, lean startup teaching, experiment-driven design, having a mindset around experimentation. And in many cases, a lot of the models that are in the Testing Business Ideas book have been around. They've been tossed around for the better part of a decade. Now we have more of a practical roadmap that we can use from the book to put into the hands of startups, put into the hands of accelerators, and see what they do with it. What are some of these practical applications? How do you envision the book and these methods being used moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to move the slide forward once, I can talk to you about a real story with
Sure.
regards to, a team I was working with. And this looks very kind of conceptual here in the book, but it is pretty much based on a real story. So I do a lot of advising with teams. Again, they're trying to find out who their customers are. And if you take something as simple as an online ad and treat that as an experiment, you should probably have a hypothesis before you go in and start running ads. What are you trying to learn from running your ads? And, basically how do you take that learning and inform what you're doing next? And, I think where we've kind of tripped up over the years has been, well, we see a lot of diagrams in books, but we don't know how to make that practical, and we don't know how to make that influence our day-to-day lives, especially, in the craziness of startup world. And if you look at this one, it's a really simple story. It's, if you think of back to 4 steps where you say, hey, our customers need to have the problem, be aware of it, and actively seeking a solution to that problem. Pretty standard kind of way of thinking. But when you think about that, how would that inform your practical day-to-day work? Well, it kind of depends on your startup idea and where you're at, right? If you are going after people that just have a problem and you're trying to build awareness, the way you run your ads, the way you treat them as experiments, it's a lot of awareness building, trying to help people understand like this is a real problem, and yes, we recognize it, we're experts. It's quite different though when people are actively seeking a solution to that problem. And it's like, where do they go to seek the solution to that problem? Do they go online? Do they go offline? And so just a quick story, I was working with a team that was working on mouth pain, and this was a mouth pain product. And we thought, okay, well, let's try to push, these ads to people who, we can pull them into, or basically push ads to them, have them drop into our landing page. And then we have a call to action on a mouth pain product that we have. Very, polished web page. It's a product we were testing. We were going through compliance hoops. It was moving forward, right? It was really interesting. Almost nobody converted. We had like a 1 to 2% conversion on our landing page. And, before we gave up, we said, look, if I had mouth pain, what would I do? Well, I would go to my dentist. I would go to my doctor. I might even go online and Google and just search. And we said, you know what, let's go check just search volume on that problem. Are people actively seeking a solution to that problem online? And sure enough, there was a pretty decent sized amount of search volume going on there. So same ad, basically same page, but we did, Google search only results, where basically you type in the search bar, your result comes back as an ad. And we had a 40% conversion. So it's ridiculous, like 1 to 2% trying to push ads to people, right? 40% catching people while they're seeking a solution to the problem. And it seems really trivial. And I know, I think, Ryan, you were even in a session I did once about explaining this concept when I was testing content for the book. And I remember that in San Francisco in that open space we were in. And, but it doesn't, people don't connect those dots, right? We look at diagrams and stuff in books and we say, well, that's cool, but I don't know how to kind of use that in day-to-day. Well, in my day-to-day work, when I'm trying to help people that are feeling very uncertain about their ideas, this team almost gave up. They almost gave up too early because they were trying to just push ads. Nobody was converting. They were really demoralized. And we said, look, let's try a different approach. Let's try to find people that are actively seeking and pull them over. Granted, it's a smaller set of, people, but 40% conversion is huge. That's a ridiculous amount of like people converting. And so I feel like this is kind of just a glimpse into that window of what it's like day to day working with teams and founders. Is we get demoralized and we need to be able to kind of say, okay, can we try another thing and kind of learn more? But I find this is like a perfect example to share because it's taking these conceptual things and like, what's it like in a day-to-day, startup?
I feel like, drawing from my own personal experience, I've encountered this issue often as well. And what I think one of the main emergent benefits of a book like this is that you have a larger toolbox. So you don't always, quickly know what is the right approach to do an experiment, but then you can reference it, see that there's this big toolbox of options to draw from, kind of work with your team to figure out which approach you want to try and create a plan for how you'll conduct those experiments. And then you're off and running a lot faster than you would be otherwise. Would you agree?
Oh, I do. And Beth, I'm curious, like in accelerator world for you, like, do you find this opportunity to kind of make abstract things practical to people, and have you seen things like this?
Oh, 100%. I mean, every interaction that the accelerators we've run have focused on is actually like this core thing of like, how can we focus on that riskiest assumption? How can we identify what it is, first of all, because working on the right assumption in the right order is half of the battle. But then once you've identified that assumption, crafting an experiment that actually helps you resolve that question is crucial, because it's easy to, I think so much of what this process does is it designs for like just very easy to understand human behavior. So without a model like this, without a systematic framework for running these experiments, we as humans, we tend to either do the things we're good at or that we like. Sometimes those are the same thing. So it's easy, as if you're a founder who, in this case, maybe has a lot of expertise in online advertising, it's easy to gravitate to the thing that you're good at or that you really understand really well and like, rather than doing the thing that's actually going to get you to success. And that's what I'm interested in, is how do we like predictably help founders get to success? And so this framework, this model for identifying the assumption, developing a hypothesis that can be tested and that there's a success metric attached to it, running that as fast as possible to find out, are we going down the right path or do we need to adjust this in some way? I find that when founders really own that methodology, they bring like a discipline to their decision-making process that gets them to the answer faster. And it, David, to your point, like there's still luck involved. My goodness, there's so many things to figure out in kind of any kind of innovation. But the path to figuring it out is just so much faster. And honestly, it ends up being less risky. So, I think that's another place where investors think in terms of risk, founders think in terms of opportunity. Founders are very optimistic, and we have to be to tackle the kinds of challenges that we're working on. But the more that I've found founders embracing risk as a core part of figuring out the opportunity, they get to the answer so much faster.
So let's talk about risk then. We've talked about risk through the lens of a company's business model, right? So risky business assumptions, mapping, prioritization, using testing business ideas with the business model canvas, designing experiments that flow from those connections. Risk is a much bigger space though, right? Entrepreneurial risk, startup risk, that's one form of risk. There are whole industries that have grown up around modeling of risk. And so that's sort of an interesting segue into what you work on, Beth. How can we improve the way that we model startup risk? And so you're going to talk a little bit about Fluency Score, and then maybe we can begin to connect the dots between testing business ideas, Fluency Score, and how we should understand risk moving forward in our new environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So using the process that David has described in his book and has been sharing with us here, my team and I really went out into the market to test some assumptions around ways we could help startups succeed. And the thing that we discovered that was most needed to help everybody understand startups better, evaluate them better, put resources towards startups better, was really, we needed better data. Like no startup is going to be successful if they're not measuring what they're doing and then optimizing for what works and getting rid of the things that don't. But there weren't really any tools for doing that at the sort of startup support level. So, accelerators are saying that they help entrepreneurs make 2 years of progress in 90 days. And my question as an accelerator director was, what does 2 years of progress look like if we don't have any data-driven metrics to describe that progress? And so the Fluency Score is really addressing that in a system-wide kind of industry level way by bringing data to the conceptualization of specifically product market fit and business model risk. So you can see in this diagram that it does two interesting things. One, we're able to actually put a number on companies. So when we measure companies, they're being measured out of 7,000 points, and it gives us a way to rank and compare similar companies. But it also does the wheel, that visualization around it, is demonstrating where the risks are in both the business model itself and in the approach to de-risking it. So the blue side is all looking at like, where are the risks in those assumptions the founders have? Where have they actually de-risked those assumptions? Which is super helpful for knowing where to pay attention, because if you know where the risks are and you can start to quantify that, that's super useful to both accelerators and investors, but also to the founders themselves in bringing an objective, standardized approach to understanding those risks and using them to kind of diagnose where to pay attention. The green side is looking at how fast and how focused the team is at de-risking. So it's more around process and approach, because we know so much about a huge amount of the risk in a startup is that they're just going to run out of time and resources before they've had a chance to solve for the kind of the blue side, the business model side. And so it gives us a picture that allows us to measure companies from day one. Literally, we could measure a company on the first day they exist, all the way up to Series A, and use it as a tool for starting to investigate what's happening in these companies, both at an individual company level, but also as a massive data set of companies across the world, all at different stages, different industries, demographics, geographies, and really start to see the patterns and trends on what's happening in these companies, what makes a successful company move faster, that sort of thing. So there's some really interesting applications as our database grows.
So Beth, as I mentioned a minute ago, risk modeling exists in many different industries. It's nothing new to those industries, but why hasn't this type of risk modeling, sort of like a FICO score modeling, not existed in the startup industry up until now? Is it rooted in data as a problem, like you mentioned, or has it been something else?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the right question. So to what we were talking about earlier, I think that for a long time, the processes for innovation are still so new. Like David mentioned, lean startup's been around for 10 years. Relatively speaking, that's not very long. And so I think there's been a long period of time as these methods of managing innovation, whether it's design thinking or lean startup or agile, they've all been emerging and developing in parallel tracks across lots and lots of companies. And so while they were still kind of in the early development phase, a lot of the work that people were doing and testing these processes, they were happening, but no one had codified it, and it wasn't a repeatable thing yet. And so a lot of the things that were working felt like luck. It felt like magic, lightning in a bottle. We figured something out and we unlocked this mystery, and it's just like this magic thing. Let's put, $5 million on it and see if we can grow it in an insane way. And what's completely true now is that there are these really systematic approaches. Not everyone's using them, so it still feels like magic most of the time to most people. But there is a process for doing this work that can be measured, and it can be optimized, and we can use that as a tool to get better at this work and not just rely on luck. And so that's where I think we're just starting to reach a place in this industry where there's enough maturity of the systems, and there are ways to measure this now that probably weren't true even 3 or 5 years ago, and they are true now. And it's about the maturity of the industry toward a more process-driven, data-driven approach to innovation, which to me is a really exciting opportunity, because founders are already putting everything they can into being successful. And if there are ways to do it to increase the likelihood of success, I think that really changes the industry.
So let's switch gears and talk about the topic that's on everyone's minds, which is, how is coronavirus going to impact the startup industry? Even corporate innovation is being impacted across the board. What do you guys think? I mean, how are we going to continue to innovate and validate and test and design experiments in this new environment? Is it going to be easier, harder, or just different? What do we think?
Well, I think it's definitely going to take on a different form. You know, when I'm talking to companies, even 5, 10 years ago, we'd run exercises where we say, hey, like, what would happen if you can no longer sell your product? What would happen if all your channels went away? So especially with retail, really struggling. And this is only going to expedite some of the extinction of retail, unless it can take on a different form. And what would happen if, another company was created? Like, how would you create another company that would kind of take you out? What we didn't have in that conversation is what would happen if we had a pandemic. I feel like we talked about climate change in a lot of my kind of design thinking workshops, but I feel like the access to customers, there were already some people that could do it remotely. I think now they're going to be forced to. So I think of, like, in the book, I have a case study of a company that did a bunch of pop-up stores. And so they went around, they did San Francisco and they had some other cities, and they did pop-up stores, and they tested their product by grabbing people off the street, interviewing them, walking them into the store, doing pre-sales, finding, all these great quotes from them about, did they have the need that they were trying to solve? And I think we're going to be a little more creative about that, because some of those physical experiences where, I've worked with stores and consumer packaged goods companies where we would literally intercept people walking through a store, and we would do an interview there, or we would do some kind of in-store experiment. So I think specifically for the physical products, we're going to have to be a little more creative as what we can do remotely. I think software, to an extent, was already, a lot of it was happening remotely already. You could go and find customers online, you could reach out, you could do video calls with them and interview. You could have them, virtually rank things online using surveys or using kind of an online whiteboard. There was a lot kind of already happening with software companies that was, remote. But I think a lot of this in-person stuff where we were doing physical intercepts with folks, it's like, how do we recreate those remotely? I'm really curious, Beth and Ryan, your take on this too.
Yeah, I do a bit of teaching in addition to consulting, as both of you know. And one of the things that is so important to me is teaching my students to be really grounded in proper user research methods. And traditionally, we've always strongly advocated for in-person discovery interviews or usability testing. All of this we prefer to do in person, so that you can really see someone's body language and really have a deeper human connection with the subject. All of that is going to change, obviously. And so I've had to pivot the way that I teach some of these research methods so that students and clients are having these interactions over video conferencing instead, which, you still see them, you're still interacting with them, it's human, but it feels different. It is different in a way. And it's just something that we're going to have to adapt to moving forward. Beth, what do you think?
Oh man, I have so many thoughts, because I really wanted to see what it looked like to do virtual entrepreneurial training and development long before we reached this moment. And I think that what this kind of pivotal moment in our industry is doing is it's clarifying our priorities. And I think that's great because it allows us to like reorder the priorities and focus on the things that make the biggest impact. So I can kind of speak to that on two levels, both on the founder level and also kind of at a programmatic founder support level. And at a founder level, there's sort of a common activity where founders are like, okay, I know I need to get user research, I need to do the user research, I need to do customer discovery. And I have been guilty of doing this myself in the past, in the long ago history of being like, okay, if I need to talk to customers, let me just go to a place where there are a bunch of these people and just like interview as many as possible. And that immediate like ability to find people in physical spaces didn't require the same discipline that we ask of the founders that work in our programs, which is to say, not everyone is your customer. Let's figure out those key characteristics of your early adopters that really set them apart from like 99.9% of the people that will buy your product in the future, and identify where those people are in the world. And what's interesting about the founders that we've worked with, because we tend to work in these sort of non-traditional startup communities, is that, you know, a founder working in Iowa has the same ability to build a world-class competitive business, because if you can build a company anywhere, but your early adopters might not be in rural Iowa. They might be in Chicago or New York or San Francisco. And so like for a long time, we've been helping founders brainstorm, how do you find these people in the little pockets of the internet or of the world that are these like really clear early adopters. And, you know, in many ways, the internet and using virtual tools allows us to get really clear. It's that clarifying bit again of about who these people are and where they exist, which ends up being a huge boost later on when you're trying to market to a lot more people like them. So it kind of gives you a leg up on that future, more scalable marketing approach. So that's on the founder side, but I would say the same thing is true on programs for founders around this like clarifying and reprioritizing, because you know a lot of entrepreneurial programs have been built around optimizing for collisions and optimizing for luck, which is the old model, right? It's the thing we needed to do before we really understood how this work got done in a systematic, repeatable way. And this is an opportunity for programs to reimagine the services that they offer to startups and say, well, what are the most important things for founders right now? And like I have that conversation with any accelerator director any day, and my answer will always be help them figure out their riskiest assumptions, help them run those experiments, and figure out what to do with the data they collect. And like if you can do that well, a program can support founders, and that can be done remotely, and it scales really nicely.
So great, thank you, Beth. Looking forward, one of the things that we wanted to think about was just the reality that a lot of these programs, and granted, you've been running virtual programs for a long time, Beth, but a lot of programs that have not had a virtual component are going to have to change. They will have to adapt to this new environment, using all the tools that both of you have been talking about that have been accessible for quite a long time, but maybe it was not so readily apparent how they could use them effectively. So how is this going to impact sort of the numbers game that we all think about when we think of that funnel of companies coming into accelerator programs, or the funnel that venture investors think about, the numbers game that basically underpins how all of this works. How is that going to adapt as we move forward as well?
Yeah, I think we're still learning. On this slide from the book, basically what I was trying to do was to visualize what I've seen happening as far as changing investment behavior goes. And I think it's just going to be accelerated. So for example, how do we fund smaller things like basic level funding and almost, I know there's this go big or go home kind of funding strategy as well, but I think especially now, it's really risky. And so I think if I had to one of my, hat here. I think VCs are going to become a little more kind of risk averse and do more base hit level funding, like C level and then launch level, and try to, we've been talking about this for years, but can we get portfolios of companies to behave more like, we're showing evidence that we have traction. We're building on that evidence. Give us a little more funding to get further down the road. And I was just reading a tweet today from a founder who said, like, I'm never going into a VC's office again. I raised my Series A on Zoom. And so I do think there's going to have ripple effects in the community with regards to how do we look at investments and what do we expect? And the power dynamic's different over Zoom. I have to say, like, it's not going into that, you're not driving down Sand Hill Road and all nervous and sweaty in your rental car, right? You're just like, hey, I'm on video chat, and it's different power dynamic, right? So I think it's going to be super interesting to see how that plays out. But I see from an investment point of view, I feel like it's going to be a lot more like, hey, let's give you enough funding to get started and show evidence, and then let's kind of build on that and do more incremental investing.
I think that there's a sense among especially venture investors that the current model will have to shift quite a bit. I listened to a podcast recently that was with Mike Maples from Floodgate. I think it was on the Knowledge Project podcast. And, he was talking about how grueling it can be to just listen to all of these pitches in person all the time, the sort of traditional Sand Hill Road startup pitch. And in a way, I think some of them are relieved that now a lot of this will be virtual. You still want to capture the key relationship building component, right? You're investing in a person and a team. It's not just about the metrics, but I think there's definitely this palpable sense that things are really going to change a lot, maybe more so than they did after the dot-com bust and after the global financial crisis, which were both, two major contractions in the industry. So looking at the time, let's pivot into some questions. We've been taking in a bunch of questions, and we've had a chance briefly to look through some of the questions that were submitted. I think one of them that David and Beth and I looked at and liked was from Eduardo. Okay, so Eduardo asked, is this de-risking and assumption testing strategy the same for new businesses in markets that already exist? Good question. David and Beth, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'm curious what Beth thinks too. Yes, in the sense of you're going to have to position yourself as having a unique value proposition. Nowadays, your solution has to be almost 10 times better than what people are doing today. Otherwise, the behavior change isn't going to happen, and they're never going to adopt your thing, even if it's better, even if it's slightly better. So a lot of the same techniques. It's a little easier, actually, if you're doing it in an existing market, because there is a known quantity. I think if you're going into creating your own market, it's a little tougher because there's no evidence to pull from, right? You have to manufacture all your own evidence. But yeah, it's similar. It's just you still have to have a very unique value proposition. Your business has to be defensible, and you have to compete on more than just price here. So how do you actually get to the job to be done behind the customers where they're struggling with existing solutions, and how do you make your thing unique? I feel like if you want a good example, Hotel Tonight is an amazing example of that. They said, we're going to do one thing, we're doing it really well. You got on a plane, you landed, you forgot to book your hotel room, you need a hotel tonight. Click, where are the hotels tonight? Book, They were able to go into an industry that was saturated, super expensive to compete in, and they did quite well, and they used these techniques. So I think there are great examples you can pull from here about how to do this in the existing market.
And I would add on top of what you just said, David, there's a key concept that people should learn about, which is the idea of category creation or becoming the king of your category, which is sort of an extension of the idea of really solidifying and understanding your value proposition. So the idea that Salesforce, for example, owns the category of customer relationship management. If you're a new business in an existing market, it's still possible to differentiate yourself by really carving out that niche for yourself and naming the category and owning it. And that is just another good practice to think about, to learn more about as you are really validating that value proposition.
Absolutely. And I would just add like one other idea to this, to anyone who's still trying to wrap their heads around where to apply this methodology. And the answer is wherever there are unknowns. And the job of the entrepreneur, whether they're running R&D in an established company and trying to open up a new product line, or it's a founder working in their home trying to build a startup anywhere in the world. Like in any place where there's innovation happening, meaning there's the opportunity for value creation, right? It is the job of the person doing that innovation work to think about what they believe to be true. So this is the pitch. Their pitch is what they believe to be true about their business. And then start to identify the places where they have data to back up those assertions. And the data comes from those experiments. And if you don't have data yet, it's still an assumption and it's still worth testing. And so there's always going to be, I think in the innovation game, there's always things that you have more evidence that you're on the right track. And then there are places where you don't. And it's about identifying those and then ranking them so that you can focus on the biggest risk at the right time.
Absolutely. All right, so let's ask another question. I think this one we can address quickly. It's a good one. How much time should a founder actually spend on the searching and testing phase?
Oh, can I take that one, please?
Yes.
You should take as long as it takes. And at the same time, move as fast as possible. This is an interesting tension for founders to manage. Because our goal is to move super, super fast. But at varying points in this de-risking process, there are questions that have to be answered. There's assumptions that have to be tested. And sometimes you can't rush the discovery and the learning process. And this is maybe one of the biggest tensions that I see founders struggle with, because there's an expectation that you can show up at a certain day and time and stand on stage and give a pitch and say, my business looks like this, it's going to work like this, it's going to grow like this. And often that moment comes before a lot of these things have actually been validated through experimentation. And so I would say founders need to give themselves the space and the time to get the real answers, optimizing constantly for running very fast experiments in the short term to get closer to that answer, so that you're kind of constantly directionally moving towards the right answer.
I would also agree and add to that in my experience, it's really difficult to have your research and discovery process be part of an agile sprint process. So for those of us and those teams that are working in, say, a typical 2-week sprint cycle, I often recommend decoupling the discovery and research process and the experiment process from that 2-week sprint cycle, so that the people who are running those experiments don't feel like they're just being measured on their velocity or their output, right? We have a lot of discussion in our community right now about outcomes over outputs and why that's important and how to think about that. And as you said, Beth, it's really important to give those teams space to breathe and do the hard work they need to do, so that the outcomes or the discoveries they make will inform the development process and not feel like that there's a fire lit under them to try to adhere to that sprint cycle. David, what are your thoughts on that?
The quick answer is it never stops. So discovery never stops. I was at the first startup I joined. We were a fintech startup that pivoted again from B to or B to C to B to B. We didn't make that change until a couple of years into the journey. I was there 8 years. It's a long marathon, right? So that discovery for you, depending on your company, obviously needs to happen. If we had given up, we would have shut it down a couple of years in, but we realized that financial advisors were the ones that really loved our product, even though they weren't our customer. If we hadn't been aware enough of that, we would have shuttered the startup. So I think it never stops to an extent, and you have to give it time, right? And so it's this idea of like a startup success happens quickly. That hasn't been my experience anyway.
One final question before we're at time. This question comes from Amin. With COVID, we noticed how desperately we need to upgrade our public sector. How would you approach helping public sector companies with the same processes? Are the methods even applicable to large public institutions?
I can touch on that quickly. So from my experience, so I've done work with Singularity University. I've advised Code for America and their accelerator program in the past. I've done some work with the IMF in Washington, D.C. The principles are the same. The tools end up being a little different. So I'll use something like a mission model canvas, which is an adaptation of the business model canvas, which goes more into impact and getting buy-in. But it's a similar flow. You know, we sketch out our mission model canvas, we theme it, desirable, viable, feasible, where's our risk? And then we design experiments to address that risk. So yes, it does apply. It's just the tools are a little different. And either way, you have to reduce risk because, you know, you have to make that thing, you know, like if you're trying to solve for hepatitis C outbreak in the South, right? You still have to measure, are we putting something in place that actually is working, you know, and you still have to kind of take that rigor and apply to it. So the projects I've worked on, yes, it's just the tools look slightly different.
All right, well, that brings us right up to the top of the hour. Thank you, David and Beth. Really appreciate your time and your insights today. Check out David's new book, Testing Business Ideas. It's definitely part of the canon of startup books moving forward. I think so. I think it's a valuable resource. And also make sure to check out Beth's work in Fluent Studio, the Fluency Score. I think that we will all be hearing much more about the Fluency Score and risk modeling for startups moving forward. So thank you again to our speakers. The webinar recording and links will be shared by email later this week. That'll include a transcript of the talk. If you'd like to follow up with us, feel free to email us at info@columbiaventurecommunity.com. Thanks and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.